I'm Rachel Gilkey. I'm Director of Programming and Education at Irish Arts Centre here in New York. We're pleased to partner with Visual Artists Ireland to present today's talk with Alice Maher and Rachel Fallon on their exhibitions, The Map and Untying the Knots. Rachel Fallon is a visual artist using sculpture, drawing, photography, and performance techniques to deal with themes of protection and defense in domestic realms and address women's relationships with society. Alice Maher's work touches on a wide range of subjects, often reprising, challenging, and expanding mythic and vernacular narratives. She's recognized for her experimental use of non-traditional materials, her explorations of embodiment and identity, and her incorporation of a range of literary, historical, and folkloric subject matter in a multivarious practice that spans drawing, painting, sculpture, and photography. She represented Ireland at the Sao Paulo Biennial in 1994. I share these backgrounds of both artists because, as you will learn across the conversation today, you can see how their collaborations embody both of their interests. And indeed, they first met when working together on the Artists Repeal the Eighth campaign. We opened the map on September 6th, installed in our flexible theater space. You can see some of it behind me now, and the great detail, all hand-sewn, embroidered, painted, and embellished by Alice and Rachel across 3 years, has been enjoyed by visitors of all backgrounds, including just earlier this week, the President of Ireland. The map was commissioned by Rua Red South Dublin Arts Centre as part of the Magdalene series curated by Melissa Boyle. This monumental textile sculpture imagines and reimagines the life, legacy, and mythology of Mary Magdalene and her impact on women's lives. An audio installation, We Are the Map, created by Sinead Gleason and Stephen Shannon, accompanies it. It is installed here throughout the end of this month. We are also delighted that as part of today's talk, we get to hear about Untying the Knots, installed building-wide at Irish Arts Centre for the next 3 months. Building from Alice and Rachel's collaboration on the map is a new collaborative work as part of this exhibition, The Mantle, which hangs in the atrium, as well as new individual works installed across the building. Alice and Rachel will be in conversation with Sarah Kelleher, art critic, curator, and educator, who will discuss these new works with the artists. Sarah lectures in modern and contemporary art, history, and theory at MTU Crawford College of Art and Design. She's a co-editor of Enclave Review, the contemporary art periodical, and has written catalog essays for such galleries as Ulterior Gallery, Domo Ball Gallery, the Hugh Lane Gallery, and the Crawford Gallery in Cork. Her curatorial practice has taken her to the Irish Museum of Modern Art, Lavitt Gallery Cork, and Ballinglen Arts Foundation. Before we begin with Rachel, Alice, and Sarah, I'm going to welcome Emer Fallon of Visual Artists Ireland for a few words.
Thank you very much, Rachel. It's an honour for us to be here this afternoon in this lovely collaboration. And I'd like to welcome our entire audience on behalf of Noel Kelly and the team at Visual Artists Ireland. It'll be a wonderful conversation and a wonderful transatlantic partnership. And as long as the technology bears with us, we will all be extremely happy this afternoon. So you're here to hear Alison, and you're here to hear Rachel and Sarah. So with that, I'm going to say thank you very much and hand you to Sarah. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you very much, Emer, and thank you so much, Rachel, for that very generous introduction. Just before I begin to bombard Alice and Rachel with my questions, a little bit of housekeeping. For those of you who are joining us on Zoom, we have the opportunity for you to present your questions to Alice and Rachel. There'll be about 10 minutes at the end of our discussion for questions. So you can type your questions into the Q&A function, which you'll find just at the bottom of your screen there, and I will then present them at the end of this session to both Alice and Rachel. So with all of that said, I would like to start firstly by offering my huge congratulations to Alice and Rachel on the success of this show, Untying the Knots, and on the quite fabulous reception that the map has garnered. It's garnered really considerable critical attention, and just recently was reviewed in Brooklyn Rail as a triumph that merges artistic skill with righteous political activism, which I think really hits the nail on the head, because it really stands, I think, the map as one of the most impactful works to have come out of Ireland since the pandemic, and one that has really resonated with so many people as we, as a culture, try to reckon with the violence and the legacy of our recent history. But it's wonderful to see you both sitting in front of a new work, The Mantle, which is as rich in its references and in its iconography as the map. And this is a work that indeed stemmed from the map. So maybe we could start with that. Rachel, if you'd like to take this maybe to start with, how did this work come about? How did it spring from the map?
Well, I suppose we were invited very generously and kindly by Rachel Gilkey at the Irish Arts Centre to come and do a site visit when the installation of the map had been proposed in the theatre. And on seeing the space, we were really interested in how we could engage with it, and in a manner that would, you know, kind of showcase both our work and the possibilities within a space like this. And there was this wonderful atrium, which, you know, covers the 2 floors. When you arrive in the building, you go up the stairs to reach the theatre. And it was a really, really lovely way of kind of creating this sense and environment before you entered the map space. It also gave us a chance to kind of expand on some of the ideas that had come at the end of making the map, like the imaginal discs. So maybe Alice, you might like to talk about that a bit.
Yeah, they were just visible behind Rachel Gilkey's face there when she was introducing you and speaking. But as we came to the end of making the map, and it took 3 years, as you know, so it's a long time making, we wondered how to end it. You know, how do you end something with so many features and so many connections? So we had heard by chance a science program on Sunday, you know, on the radio, as you would when you were working. And they talked about these imaginal discs that creatures who metamorphose have all over their bodies. They have the discs that imagine what the next stage of their life is to be. And they remember what the last stage was. So we just thought this was a beautiful way to kind of incorporate metamorphosis and imagining a better future, you know, into the work. So that's where you see that imaginal forest. So that's where we kind of moved from using this kind of disc shape and to bring it into the next work that we were to do. Now, we didn't have the same amount of time to make this either. So, you know, we were in a bit of a hurry. You know,
pandemic had an upside for you.
Yeah. So everything was condensed and concise, and we had to really, you know, be very precise about our thoughts.
Yeah. And so because we were using cloth as well, we were looking at the history of cloth and the history of clothing, and in particular reference to our own culture, you know, Irish culture. And we were reading, we had read some really nice books that were lent to us about Irish clothing and how the mantle, the Gaelic mantle was actually forbidden or was outlawed with the wearing of the mantle because it covered, you know, covered everything. And I suppose subversively you could have weapons in there or something, but also people wore it when they were naked. They just wore a mantle. And so that was considered too Gaelic, you know, so that was outlawed. And then the color saffron
was really, you know, it's quite an interesting color in terms of sumptuary law. So sumptuary laws were the laws that were created around, you know, colors and clothing and who was allowed to wear what. So in at certain times in the medieval times, only certain people were allowed to wear linen, for example. So the sumptuary laws in Ireland were very much around banning the saffron cloak. And that was in those sort of laws came in, like there was the Saxon Spiegel law of 1221, which brought in a whole notion of ideas around patterns and stripes, you know, being for deviance.
And of course the mantle as a shape is mirrored in the map also. When you look at the map, is in like almost in the shape of a great mantle, and one of the constellations is called Mantellum, the mantle. So
and the other part of, you know, when you look at that beautiful painting by Artemisia Gentileschi, Penitent Magdalene. What is she wearing? She's wearing a saffron dress. So there was a period of time when the Magdalene was also dressed in saffron
as a color. So, and then...
And I saw the kind of like aversive nature of that.
Well, it was considered a prostitution color.
Yeah.
Sorry, it was considered a color for, you know, in certain areas. So the sumptuary laws changed depending on where you were, but in certain areas, yellow was kind of considered a very subversive color. And
so we were looking at the color, the mantle, and then we had this great book called The Devil's Cloth, which was about the stripe. You know, how the stripe was used in clothing to other people, you know, as, you know, the prisoner, the prostitute, the heretic, the murderer, you know, all these people were forced to wear stripes so that they'd be recognized. It's like knowing who the other is. So in the construction of the mantle, maybe Rachel would address that, how you use the stripe as part of the construction.
So we didn't want to actually be really obvious about certain things. We wanted to go back to using a lot of those very subtle methods that we had developed in the map. And pleating was one of the ones that became really interesting. So the whole center of it is pleated. So you can see here, so it's back and forth like concertina pleats that are hidden with French seams. But again, like the map, this has an obverse. So the other side of it is white, but all the seams are covered in red lines. And really, we were thinking about both the stripes and also the ideas, you know, because this is talking about colonial histories, the red lines that have been drawn through maps throughout history, segregating people with no concern about who would be on either side of these laws. So this was kind of a very important thing.
And of course,
sorry, Alice, go on. I was going to say there's so much.
Go ahead, Sarah, you go. Yeah.
Grand, I'm sorry, there's a bit of a delay, I think. There's so much to unpack in the map in terms of its facture, in terms of its iconography, but also in terms of its language, because we're looking at it and we can see, in a second I might share a larger detail, that as well as these imagistic details and facture, there is text throughout this, and it's text in Irish, and particularly it's text in the Old Irish alphabet. And it reads Scuilamish Gach Snoiv. And I wonder if you could translate that for us and tell us a little bit about where that came from.
Yeah, well, of course, Irish was also banned, you know what I mean, as a language. So we wanted to include that in our mantle. And I'm learning Irish, relearning Irish, you know, as well in my own life. So we wanted to include the language that had been barred, but we all kind of have that language within our bodies, we felt, you know, and that we know it somehow and halfway and half don't, you know, but that it is part of us. And we wanted to use the word, Rachel was talking about using the word free.
We wanted to use freedom and release.
Release,
like that.
You know, like to release. So, but we couldn't find the right phrasing. So we wrote to that wonderful Irish language poet, Derny Grifa. You know, I had done a book with her in the past and spoke to her about what we were doing. And it was her who came up with that phrase, Scuilamish Gach Sneim, because she said that the word Sneim, not, really reminded her of what we were doing in our work, which was using knots, you know, in terms of sewing, but also unknotting and untying knots. And in a way, that's where the title of the whole exhibition came from, Untying the Knots. So Scuilamish Gach Sneim is like an aspiration. We untie all knots, or we want to, or we wish to release all knots. Yeah.
And that collective verb there, that scuilamish, let us untie the knots. Again, it's this really kind of positive exhortation to future action. And looking at the form of the mantle there, I'm reminded also of the banners that you collaborated on for the artist campaign to repeal the 8th Amendment, and that sense of this enormous banner that in its kind of monumental size takes on something of, you know, the idea of St. Bridget's cloak that's stretched gigantically to cover a huge territory. This sense of, again, something that is a kind of gesture towards collective action,
and
which
regaining,
is,
like
again,
regaining territory, like, yeah.
Absolutely. I just want to share some details here because I'm conscious that there is so much rich iconography in this work that maybe some of the viewers might not be able to appreciate from that vantage point. Can you see that there now?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm hoping that you can.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
there's a detail of the text, and also I want to point to these just details that you shared with me of some of the motifs as they were in progress. Can you see those?
Yes. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Because there's so much iconography to unpack in this, and I wondered if you would kind of talk to us a little bit, maybe Alice, about what's going on in this image here.
The one on the left. There are kind of medallions, you know, up along that left side, contained in a type of tree or, you know, kind of root system. And we were looking at the kind of triple goddess that comes from, you know, our own culture. And the three aspects of that goddess are prophecy, fertility, and fury. You know, so we included those in the three medallions, and there's a further one down below which we can talk about later. But this one on the left that you're asking about, we would consider we used as the medallion of prophecy, you know, and it's related to the banshee as well, you know, in our own culture, who prefigures death, or death, the coming of death. So, of course, the death that is all around us at the moment is what we see on our TV screens of these poor bodies, you know, wrapped up in white plastic, just laid on the ground, and people weeping over them. And that's why we included that. So the work we have done with the map would also have included contemporary, you know, images from contemporary life and what's happening, you know, all around us. So we connect that to the deep distant past, you know, and to the continuum of like what's happening today. So that's what that little, and I suppose the fringe work there is almost like the tears and the weeping that's forever, you know, continuing. And the next one down, then you can't see it there, but is the fertility. And then after that, fury, which of course represents war, you know, and the fury of war and death. And you might talk about the last one down there. You can just see it, the little red fly.
Red fly is Aton, you know, who is
here.
a symbol of metamorphosis, and how she was this princess who was turned into a fly and then was, you know, sipped in a drink by the queen, who had not been, she'd been infertile and she hadn't been able to have children, and she was then reborn again as
herself.
Yeah. So it's like this rebirthing of your own self, but in a different form, and a more evolved form.
Yes. Yeah.
And then there's the little discs at the end, maybe that's the kind of tie into the imaginal discs.
The imaginal disc, but also, again, listen to another science program, and this is like tying, you know, science with art in lots of different ways. We heard about this breakthrough research in University College Galway on, you know, they were looking at Celtic knotwork, you know, Celtic knotwork, which is the unending touching, really, in a way. Because if you look at our own early manuscripts, you know, like the Book of Durrow or the Book of Kells, and the Celtic knotwork seems to, you know, it's absolutely never ending. Everything is touching everything else and going back to touch where it began, you know. So that kind of concept and philosophy we wanted to bring into our work, and we were really interested. They were using this phrase for their discoveries called hyperbranching. Hyperbranching.
Oh, wow.
And we just thought that is almost a description of the imaginal forest, which we have, you know, in the map inside there. So hyperbranching in science, hyperbranching in culture, you know, hyperbranching in society. So all those little discs represent diagrams that we saw in the scientific research of hyperbranching.
And how everything is really connected to everything else, that nothing exists without its own context, and how the context kind of dictates
and turns back on itself, but also continues, you know, and can continue to change. So, yeah.
also everything has within it the possibility of transformation, because within these works that, you know, kind of like confront these very, very painful and violent histories of oppression, there is, through a sense, a very, very profound sense, both in the map and in the mantle, of resilience and kind of a futurity and a kind of persistence,
Yes.
which I think is interesting.
Thank you. Yeah, I think, yeah, we would be of the mind, you know, that annihilation doesn't always lead, you know, it doesn't always lead to the end. Like it can lead to a hyperbranching of culture. You know, suppression, I mean, what I mean is suppression,
Yes.
if you're thinking of the Irish language, for instance, does not always lead to annihilation of that element. It can lead to a hyperbranching, like what's happening now in terms of a reinterest, you know, in our own language. So that would be our point, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, energy gathers when things have been suppressed.
Yeah.
So very often,
yes,
what happens in that moment is you have a kind of release, and that release creates something new. It's like a chemical reaction.
That's really, I think it's so powerful and so generative. And I'm just looking, like we can see where you're sitting just in front of the map there. You can see the whole scale of it here and the richness of detail, and these fantastic kind of branching roots that seem to snake down from it. And I wanted to talk a little bit about its placement, where it's hanging in the space, because I suppose many of the people here on this Zoom, like myself, are kind of like beaming in from Ireland and might not have had an opportunity to yet be in the Irish Arts Centre. So can you tell me a little bit about where this is hanging?
So when you come in, it's an atrium. So it is basically
Yes.
a 3-story high vacant space. And it can
Okay.
be viewed from the 2 mezzanines on this space. So one of the mezzanines is where you actually enter and exit the theatre. And then the higher mezzanine is, there's a library space, there's some of Alice's beautiful and Jamie Murphy's beautiful Memento Civitatum shown there as well. And it's kind of talking about the singing between the works as well, you know, so it's facing in that way in towards the map. The map is on the other side of the theatre space. And then we have both of, you know, 2 lots of individual collaborative works that we've done with other people facing towards it. And it really is, I suppose, a metaphor for how everything joins together.
Yeah. Yeah, like the different, that's what we try to do, I guess, join the different spaces of the building with the 3 different levels, the foyer, the cafe area, the stairs, the window, you know, how to use everything, like how to kind of populate everything in a kind of a rebranching, you know.
But also in a coherent manner that that is easily understandable for somebody who's coming in to see what our interests are and where our kind of ideas lie.
Yeah, but of course we were so delighted to get this beautiful theatre, you know, this huge state-of-the-art, fabulous theatre to show the map, and that was just class, really. But then we had to go and do a load of work for the rest. For the rest of the space, you know, so it was like, oh God. So we also decided then that we would do on-site work, you know, on-site drawings, which we're both, you know, have done before as well. So have you images?
I'm going to share some.
Yeah,
I do. But one of the things I suppose I wanted to that you touch on there is that the Irish Arts Centre is not a traditional visual art space. It is a theatre. So it necessitated a particular strategy for you in terms of how he decided to populate the space. And I think that's really interesting. I think for the artists who are kind of who are joining in on this conversation to think about, again, how you strategically approach this space in order, as you say, for it to make sense for 2 artists with deeply individual practices, but also who make this collaborative work, to have that as a kind of a coherent statement. I am going to show now one of the works, Rachel, that you made in situ here, called Measure by Knots, which again is a really, really complex work that touches on an absolutely fascinating aspect of history that I wasn't familiar with. Could you talk us through this piece, please?
So really, when we visited the space, downstairs there's a very long wall, and there's this black and steel space around the bar, which is a very interesting textural space. It's, you know, quite imposing. And
industrial kind of looking.
Industrial, and really we're looking at, you know, if you were going to use the space in a kind of pulled back way and create work, it would be lovely to have works that would kind of mirror one another from color point of view and texture point of view. So I decided to do something that was very restrained, I suppose, and yet complex. And I went through lots of different iterations of how this was going to work. But I was interested in that idea of what it means to go somewhere else, and what do you gain and what do you lose, and what that process is. And while I was looking at these ideas, I came across an Irish language magazine called Untying, which, you know, came out in the late 1800s, was produced in Brooklyn. And what it was talking about, again, to tie into the idea of the suppression of the Irish language, was an awful lot of the people who had come over from Ireland in their endeavour to assimilate, they had lost the Irish language. And this magazine was set up with lessons in Irish, which I found absolutely fascinating. And for anybody who's interested, there's the whole archive is online in the NUIG in Galway. It's just a really, really interesting. But it was, again, that whole idea of what do you gain and what do you lose, and how do you bring these ideas back, or this feeling back. So I chose, I think it was volume 8 I was looking through, and I had looked through all the others, but there were 3 particular words that jumped out at me in lesson number 8, I think it was. And one of them was Isle, which is at the corner by the little sort of earpiece. Then there's Lame, which is down the bottom by the almost pendulum piece. And then Chin, which is over at the other side. And Al is cliff, that's what it means. And then you have Lame being jump. And then Keen is a sense of longing or melancholy, but it also means a distance over time and space. And I just found that those 3 words kind of really described that immigrant experience. You know, I have lived outside of Ireland. I mean, I lived back there again, but I had lived outside of Ireland for a long time. And that idea that, you know, you are without time and space in another space, and what is happening in your country is changing, and what you are going through is changing, and you will never be that person who left that country, and that country will never be the same when you go back to it. So it was playing with ideas around that. And again, you know, it's very, very fine crochet work on with cotton. So it's quite a basic thing, crochet being used, particularly during the famine times, as a way, you know, along with the wall building, of creating industry for Irish people, particularly Irish women, as cottage industry, and paying for them to be able to manage to earn a living during famine times.
That's fascinating, because crochet forms part of the kind of lexicon of textile work and techniques that you were using across both the map and the mantle. And when we were talking a couple of days ago, you mentioned that crochet has a different kind of brings with a different state of consciousness. I might be misquoting you there.
No, it does. It changes your brain waves. So it does have actually a neurological effect on your brain. And there's so many different types. You know, the type of crochet that is in the mantle is a very particular type.
Rope,
it's a braiding
kind of,
that you use, a passementerie in French, that you use for military braiding on the epaulettes and on the garments themselves.
So it has its own language and meaning.
Thing that I'm struck by when I'm looking at the elements of crochet, obviously here in Measure by Knots, and also thinking to the elements in the map and in the mantle, they have such a visceral kind of set of associations. This looks to me like nerves or like ganglion, like and also a little bit like an ear or something like an ovary, whereas in the map they become like entrails, and in the mantle they're like roots. it's really interesting how they have a kind of bodily parallel that makes them very visceral. And thinking about that kind of physical contact. Alice, the work that you have made for the Irish Arts Centre here, Untying, is also very, very bodily, both in its facture and its formal qualities. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Oh, it's as Rachel was describing, there was this dark metal space, that she was going to work on. And then there was this light colored, like long wall. So of course I knew straight away all you could do on that wall was do a drawing, and that it would be charcoal. So it's like the opposite color of what Rachel was using in her crochet. And I guess, I'm looking at the material of hair, as dangerous, like hair, female hair, like as we all know today, could be the cause of you actually being arrested, murdered, imprisoned, if you actually even show your, like it has such a strong resonance, in the history of the construction of femininity and the suppression of femininity, you know what I mean, as well. And its power is kind of inherent, within its materiality. So anyway, so in a way, the way I describe this is like a big whip. I think, you know what I mean? Like whipping across the space, and kind of energizing the space with that, with that whole history. So it's kind of loose at the beginning, then it's all knotted and twisted around itself, and then it's kind of loose at the end. So, it's just like a kind of gesture of untying or, unknotting. So
and
yeah,
sense of
it's
energy,
simple.
and obviously all of but also that like it packs so much kind of rich association into it, and that the idea of like it was a kind of unbound female hair is seen as such a kind of a signifier of kind of dangerous and unfettered sexuality. So that kind of sense of weaponized energy unfolding through the space is so interesting. But I'm also thinking like the the lexicon of textiles and knots that you're both using, all of the words to do with like weaving and repair, stitching and darning and knotting. They're all of these terms are so generous when it comes to thinking about work that speaks to such difficult histories. And because they bring up all of these ideas about kind of like repair and recovery. And one of the things that I think is so compelling about MAP and about the Mantle is they are works that are rooted in a very, very specific Irish history, very specific, but that they're not limited to that, that they are open and very generous to, to other potential readings. Do you think, maybe my question is here, do you think that because your choice to work in textiles is something that makes the textiles essentially are more maybe legible to more people than other artistic media might be?
Yes, I mean, I think there is an intimacy about textiles. It's something we all recognize. We all wear clothes. We have an affinity for it. And even people, who might have no interest in art have a knowledge about textile. So it's something that belongs in our psyche. And it's a very important thing. We use it to cover ourselves. We use it, to comfort, and we use it for all sorts of things. And in a way, it has a very different quality to other monumental ideas, such as, steel or bronze or marble. There's a real warmth and a real familiarity about it. It's also quite a lot of history of women's labor tied up within it, and with the politics of that labor. When you think of the garment industry, both in New York, when the Triangle Shirtwaist factory went on fire at the beginning of the 19th century, and it was the story of how a lot of garment worker unions were formed. And today in India and elsewhere, where garment workers are paid a pittance for the work that they're doing.
And of course, it was a despised kind of material in a way, you know what I mean? And we're interested in what has been suppressed, despised, or, and it's also very mobile, when you use cloth like that, it folds down very small, and you can put it in your suitcase and move along, So it's not, it may be making, in a way, monumental expression, but it's not monumental, in that it's mobile. you know, it's flexible,
Yeah.
you know,
it's not static,
it's
you know,
not static.
and I think that was very much the idea when we were looking at particularly the map and the idea around what had happened in Ireland. You know, that this is not a memorial to anything. This is not something that is finished.
Because
that all of these things are still ongoing, and I think textile has a better way of understanding that than stone is very immutable.
And even if, as we were making the mantle and sewing these elements, all around us was happening stuff, you know. That,
you can see it in some of the little tatreezas in the squares.
Those little black and white squares there.
The tiny squares. There's little symbols embroidered in for various different, you know, as symbolic for a lot of the things that are going on at the moment in the world.
Okay. I think that thing of the idea of a monumental scale and a monumental work of labor, but also refusing the idea of a monument is really, really powerful, I think, because a monument suggests that a line has been drawn under something. Do you know that something is finished? Whereas obviously the reverberations of this history are continuing to resonate. We're still reckoning with the legacies of this and how it's affected and continues to kind of affect us collectively. And I think because even in the formal kind of the formal presentation of the map here, the way that it is deliberately loose and unraveling at the end is it itself is not presenting a kind of finished, neat kind of closure to itself, which is really interesting. And I think, again, there was something I think that I was thinking about. Obviously, this is a new work made specifically for this invitation to the Irish Arts Centre in Manhattan. And I wanted to ask you about your priorities when you were making this work and when you were thinking about it and thinking about, you know, kind of like installing the map in this new setting. And what were your priorities when you were thinking about this work and the kind of proposition that you wanted to make?
Which, the map or the mantle? The mantle.
Both of it, I suppose, as a kind of a collective, as an exhibition. Yeah.
Well, in the case of the mantle, really, we were talking with Rachel Gilkey, you know, the program director, and she was very interested that we make work for the window. You know, there's a window space here that looks out on 11th Avenue, and she really likes to have that energized so that people realize what's going on. So in the beginning, we thought that we would make a piece, you know, for the window. But then, as usual, when we started working on it, it became, you know, a much bigger, more complex kind of thing. We're like, no, we're not showing that in the window. You know, that needs a different, it needs a different kind of space. So that's when we moved over to this void. And even the word itself is such an interesting thing, that you show work in a void, and something energizes that void and becomes a different space then. Okay. Now we do have work actually in the window as well, but that's work that's already extant. And that's work we had already made, you know, and we felt that that's a place, to put that.
But I mean, also what we really liked about this idea is that it can be viewed from different levels.
Exactly.
You know, so it has a very different, you know, feeling when you see it from above, when you see it from below, or when you see it like straight on, like we are at the present. You see different features, they come to light much more easily.
And it's hanging, you know. I think it was Louise Bourgeois. I think it was Louise Bourgeois who said that hanging, you know, that when something's suspended, you know, it hasn't made up its mind or something, you know, so it's like suspended, you know, it's not sitting on a pedestal or stuck to the wall, you know what I mean? And we feel the same about the map, really, don't we? Like, it's like you could see the obverse when you enter, that's the whole point.
And here, what I think is really interesting is, you know, you can't see the obverse.
Yeah.
Yes. And that's where all the lines are drawn.
Yeah.
Because you don't see them. We only know the ramifications of them, but we don't actually see those lines that are on maps. We only feel them when we're in those spaces where we have to cross borders or we have to, you know, differentiate between different areas. Yeah. So that's kind of interesting that there is another side that you actually can't see.
And I think that kind of opens onto the maybe the deeper context of my question is about the kind of resonance that this work, that the mantle and the map take on in this wider context of American politics at the moment. Obviously, they speak to very specific Irish histories, but in this new context where there's so much at stake in the political landscape, I think, like, were you kind of very conscious of that when you were plotting the layout of this exhibition, or what you would put into this exhibition, or what you wanted to include in it?
Yes.
Yes, but I also think that civil rights and human rights are a subject matter the world over. I don't think there's anywhere in the world that has resolved these issues.
No, but we are very super aware,
Yeah.
you know, that in this country, you know, the kind of laws that we worked really hard to get rid of, you know, are being reintroduced, you know.
Endangered, you know, certain rights that people have are being, you know, endangered.
Especially for women, for the position of women, you know, and children. So we'd be super aware of that, yeah. But anything we made together, like, it's not didactic. Like, we're not trying to, you know, sell a thing or teach a thing. We try to allow it, the work, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, to get in there.
I mean, and one of the other things we found out, you know, while we were making it and we were talking about it and being here, is that there were Magdalene laundries in the United States.
Which we never knew about.
Which we didn't know about. That the Good Shepherd laundry in Buffalo had existed, that they were
contacted by various people,
You know, so they were things, they were systems that were exported and were used very often here in the United States against First Nation people. So it's really interesting how much rhyming goes on in a way around these ideas.
You could kind of do it in cloth, you know, and somehow it just hangs there, you know, and people can engage with it, and it will make them think, you know, when they go walking around, you know, have a think.
It's so vibrant and beautiful, and you know, it's you see it and you're attracted to the fact that it is these wonderful bright colors, and there is something to see, and that's why it's important not to be, you know, didactic about the message.
And it was very important to us, actually, that it's showing here in the Irish Arts Centre in New York, you know, which is somehow, would you say it's like expressing the kind of changes, you know, and the kind of that are going on in Ireland, you know, at the moment, and bringing it here,
showcasing them,
and really showcasing them,
doing a wonderful job of showcasing.
And I think that's something that I wanted to talk to you about, because you have spoken before about beauty and your kind of use of beautiful fabrics and beautiful techniques as a particular strategy, a strategy that has a kind of a political impetus to it. And it's so apparent when you're looking at the extraordinary colours and the workmanship of this work. Could you talk a little bit more about beauty as a strategy for you?
Well, it's a classic feminist strategy anyway, you know, because, you know, when you look at the work of the suffragettes, or you look at the work, you know, so it's a way of drawing people into dialogue, you know, as well. But also beauty, it can have a kind of transformative experience, you know what I mean, when you experience something. And I do think that when you create something, you know, when you are creative and you make something, it is a pushback against nothingness and toxicity and negativity. You know what I mean? So when you make something that's monumental, that's beautiful, that's, you know, experiential, it's already a political act against you know, negativity, suppression, dictatorship, you know.
And there's a certain type of beauty that also carries hope with it.
Yeah.
You know, we are very much affected, our psyches are affected by our surroundings, that whole idea of psychogeography and how you respond to where you are. When we're in spaces that are beautiful, that's why people built these magnificent, you know, palaces and churches with fabulous stained glass, so that your soul or your psyche would be uplifted. And I think that has, you know, it has a really underlying effect on how we feel about the world when we see beautiful things around us. And that beauty is for everybody, that it's not a class thing as well, that it has to be accessible to other people.
You spoke about this in relation to the banners when you started working together as part of the artist campaign to repeal the eighth, and this very, conscious decision to make these very beautiful material objects that would, be part of this movement, this political movement. And could you talk a little bit about that idea of beauty as a kind of galvanizing force?
Yeah, because we wanted to make things that people would be proud to rally around, and proud to walk behind and proud to walk beside, to say, yes, that represents us, not the horrible negative no kind of, campaign of black, white, and red,
and
the
disembodied women.
a classic fascist kind of, color. So it was like it was an answer to that, pushback to that as well, wasn't it? For sure.
Oh, totally.
And we were also aware, that we wanted to make something that would last, and that if the referendum did not go through, and we were not sure, of course, as you know, at the time that was going to happen, that those banners were there to prove, that
testament.
People had fought, the artists in particular had fought, to change that law. And so signed. The minute the referendum was won, the National Museum of Ireland came to us to acquire every single one of those banners as part of the history and psyche of the nation, I suppose, you would say. And mind you, we haven't seen them since, which you're a bit worried about. So when, that's another story about when something goes into a museum, it becomes a museum.
It becomes an artifact.
Whereas, to us, they were like street mobile objects, So anyway, that's another debate. Yeah.
I'm sure they're being very carefully conserved and being prepared for
and we're grateful. Yeah.
But when we're talking about, I'm just going to move quickly through these slides. When we're talking about the use of textiles and really beautiful, gloriously worked textile pieces as part of a kind of political performance and demonstration. Rachel, I know you have a performance coming up. Your DIY Aprons of Power is scheduled for Saturday. This, obviously, the image that I'm showing now is from a performance that you did in Budapest in November. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about this.
That one in particular actually isn't in November. That was this year on International Women's Day in March of this year. And that building is a very, very particular building in Budapest. It is called Sándor Palota. And it is the office of Viktor Orbán. So he is the president of Hungary. And this work had been created when I had made the original Aprons of Power for the Artists Campaign. They had been collected by the Arts Council in Ireland, and they're shown really very often all over the place. And I had been requested to make a new set for Poland as an act of solidarity. So I created Aprons of Solidarity, and I thought, okay, these are going to be the end of the aprons that I make. And then somebody else requested for a Monica Sue exhibition, Monica Sue was a Swedish artist who lived in the UK and made a huge amount of work, which very often when galleries wouldn't show it because it was very feminist in its nature, she would batten them onto sticks and walk them through the streets. And I'd been requested, could I make a work in response to this exhibition? So I thought, well, why don't I make a work that becomes collective? And I created this dissemination series called DIY Aprons of Power. So in 2022, I was invited to be part of an exhibition in Hungary in Budapest, at the Budapest Galleria, which is part of the Kiseli. It's the historical museum in Budapest. And during that time, I became really aware of the repressive 2021 law, propaganda law that Orbán had brought in, particularly against queer and LGBTQ plus communities there, and also how much, particularly women and the minority communities there suffered, but it was all under the radar. It was very much underground. So I was commissioned to make a piece for the International Elimination of Violence Against Women Day
and that's in November. So that's where I went over. So it was 4 days of workshops where I made kits which had tea towels on one side and a colour on the other side. And I had picked a particular motto. So there's quite a careful kind of curated idea around these, that it's not a free for all. There's a huge amount of leniency and tolerance in what goes on the aprons and how it's done, but the motto has to be the same. So there's a certain unified idea. And the motto I chose for this was Ad Sum, which is a military motto again, but Latin was the official language in Hungary until 1884 because of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So again, this idea of a colonized country. And Orbán is very much about this idea of recreating a mythology of the Magyars.
Ad Sum means I am present, just to,
but it's like it's about this mythology, and the word in Hungarian is Jelen vagyok, and then I am present. So it's like a roll call. And each of these aprons took a colour. So it only worked as a group. They took a colour from the progressive pride flag. The pride flag is actually illegal to show in
It's
Hungary.
illegal, yeah.
It's completely illegal to have the pride flag. So on International Women's Day, we went up to his office, and that was this idea of, okay, it's only women wearing aprons.
Yeah.
The security guards were completely disinterested in it. And we did this, and it was in the papers, and there was, a lot of the commentary on the newspapers the next morning was, feminist protest. I wonder if that's all it was.
Yeah.
So it was really, again, it was this idea that these people that I was working with over 4 days were NGOs, they were young artists, they were activists. The oldest person was 83, and the youngest person was 18. So it was a really, large scale project. There was over 30 makers. They each have sewn their name. Some makers were, made collaboratively, one apron between 3 of them, some made more. So it was a really collaborative project, but I also wanted to bring this to New York because Orbán and Trump have such an affinity with one another, and they are great friends, and they visit one another all the time. So it just seemed really, really pertinent to bring these aprons, have this transnational solidarity between the Hungarian women, the Irish women, and the American women, and create a project.
Trans communities, not just women.
Yes, exactly. It's like this is because obviously it's the progressive pride flag. It is the LGBTQ plus community who are involved in this.
So tell her where you're going to do it.
So we are going to go. I found a particular work by a Hungarian poet who is going to be our kind of rhythm.
Yeah.
And it's very difficult to find work that's translated from Hungarian into English, and it's even more difficult to find queer poets' work in English.
Yeah.
But anyway, that is going to set our rhythm,
pace,
and we're going to go from the Brooklyn Bridge, from the Brooklyn side of the Brooklyn Bridge, across up to the Supreme Court in New York, and we're going to do an apron procession, raising the aprons there in front. So to just gesture that we are present within the community, that there's nothing that they can do about it, and they have to acknowledge that fact, and that people, it's also to give hope to people who feel that there is no hope at the moment, or who are afraid, and they have every right to be afraid.
Yeah. And there's things you can do.
Yes. What time is that performance starting, Rachel, and where is it starting from?
So it will start at the Dumbo side sign of the Brooklyn Bridge. So that is over near Clumber Corner on the top of the bridge at 2:00. And we hope to reach the courthouse by about 20 to 3 at the latest.
Fantastic.
But
Thanks
you have
so
to
much
register if you want to participate.
If you would like to, like to participate, we're there's only a very limited number because we don't want to involve getting a permit.
Yeah.
So under a certain number,
we can do it without a permit as a performance. And so if there's anybody who would still like to register, there are a few limited places left if they would email Rachel Gilkey.
Okay, perfect. So it will email anybody who's interested and who is in New York and who will be available to take part on Saturday. They can email rachel@irishartcentre.org for the information. And I can see there's loads of questions here coming in the chat. So this might be a good point for me to open up to questions from the audience. And there's a question here from Hetty Judah. And she would like to know more about the symbols in the squares, in the checkerboard behind you.
So there are 3 symbols, and it really is, you know, when we look at what is going on in the world, there's so many symbols that we could have used. We could have filled every single square of that. But we wanted to just put in small symbolic ideas around what is going on. So we have a Cuba square. So it's a small black and white square. Cuba is the pattern and that's used in textile, particularly in the Congo. But it's also thinking about, you know, the Sudan and about all of the wars that are going on there. There is a small little Ukrainian symbol. So a little stitched Ukrainian rose. Again, thinking about what's going on in Eastern Europe and with the Russian war and things like that. And then there is a small Tatriz, it's the Tatriz of Gaza. And this is also thinking about what is going on in Palestine, in Lebanon, and in the Middle East at all.
But the actual pattern comes from looking at one of our ancient manuscripts, you know, called the Book of Durrow, you know, where you see, I think it's St. Mark, and his whole robe is covered in these squares like that. So we just take imagery from, you know, from those manuscripts and use it in a different way.
And it's also like very reminiscent of a chessboard as well.
Yeah.
And in how things happen,
Games.
that games are played by higher, you know, elites that have very little to do with what people want.
And there's still the potential of maybe making moves strategically within that confined space, which is very interesting. Lots of questions here. So I'm going to start with, okay. There's a question here. How long did it take to make? And I'm presuming that that person is maybe referring to the mantle. Oh, sorry, no, on the Untying the Knots piece. So perhaps that refers to, maybe let's start with the mantle, because you did mention how you were under a little bit more time pressure than you were when you were working on that, for example.
So it was March when we went.
Well, I mean, it's also depends on what you consider, you know, because we started, obviously we had to start with a conversation and with an idea, and then with drawings and with, you know, a back and forth of how it was going to be, and symbols and reading and looking, and then you begin to make, and then more things happen. So, but the whole process, I mean, we were here in April, beginning of April, and obviously it had to be shipped
in August,
the beginning of August.
Wow.
So it was like, oh.
So it was a tight time frame.
Yeah, it was hard work now, but it was worth it.
Yeah, it was about, you know, max 4 months, but really 3 months making.
And so the site-specific pieces, maybe they're asking about too, you know, the drawing downstairs in the foyer, that was like a 5-day, you know, install, draw. And you already had made your...
I had worked like that.
The crochet.
The crochet piece, I'd done some at home. Once I'd seen it also from when we had made the site visit. So I had started that then, because it's really, really tiny crochet. So that's about 4 months of crochet.
But you know, like we have to compliment the tech team here, you know, because there was nothing that we asked for that wasn't made available to us, you know, like magnets. Could we have little magnets? Yes, you can. So, you know, and it was the same when it came to the sound work, you know, the Sinead Gleason and Steve Shannon work. So that was installed perfectly, you know, for us.
It was this, I mean, you know, the map went up. I have never seen the map go up and be lit, thanks to Mac and Manny, ever as fast, because that Brooklyn Rail review we had arrived on Sunday night. The map went up Monday morning, and she was in at
5
5:30
p.m.
on Monday to review that piece. So, you know, all kudos and thanks to the team here. They are amazing.
That's fantastic. An amazing endorsement of such, like, again, it's a very complicated install and very particular lighting. I remember a conversation with you about the very specific lighting design. So when you're standing in front of it as a viewer, that your shadow is not cast on the surface that you're looking at. So it's, again, it's very subtle, very, very particular. There's another question here from Brian from Visual Artists Ireland has collated all of these questions, so I can't see who's has asked them. But there's a question here. Alice and Rachel, I'm curious about the shape of the map itself. What was your thought process in deciding on what shape this large-scale piece would take? And that's from Vera.
The shape.
You mean the rectangular shape, presume, or maybe they're talking about the kind of cloak shape within it. I'm not too sure.
Not entirely sure.
But anyway, we just began by like, it's going to be big, you know, really big. Like scale was going to be really part of our language, you know. So we, as big as we could make it. So it's, how big is it, Rachel? Not the full thing.
It's 6 meters. 6.2 meters
by 4.2 is the 4.2.
Well, it's about 3.8, and then
it has the crochet joining to join the thing. So scale had everything to do with that shape. But if they're speaking about the shape within a shape, you know, that the light kind of comes through, that would have been influenced by maps that we had seen, you know, very early Renaissance maps, you know, for instance.
Which are being unscrolled.
Unscrolled, you know, that trompe l'oeil kind of thing. And you see it on the walls in Venice and stuff where, you know, colonists have painted their maps showing where they own, or, you know, and then the map would show where, you know, what's happening outside there, we don't know. Here be monsters, you know. So it's based on that idea of the unscrolling and the kind of trompe l'oeil map, but also on the cloak, this idea that you spoke about earlier, Sarah, about Bridget's cloak claiming space. You know, she was only going to be given a little half-acre space for her church, but then her cloak spread, you know, magically to take up the whole of the county of Kildare. So, you know, it's about that kind of expansion as well.
Occupying space. And I suppose it was also, again, designed as a very site-specific work for the person who commissioned this work, the curator of the Magdalene series, Mulisha Boyle, for the space of Rua Red, which is very, very particular. So it's a huge volume.
But it's also created, I mean, it was very much our idea that we wanted to create it as a sculptural piece, so that it would be circumnavigated, like it would exist in the round and have that sort of sense of volume as well in that way.
A physical map that you move through.
So that wasn't something that you could put against the wall. It's not, you know, supposed to be viewed in that particular way, although it was with the president.
It was. But we've had great comments, you know, from people about their experience of it when they approach it from the obverse, particularly, you know, and people say it looks like maybe a scan of human body, you know, like an interior scan, you know, of the body, or somebody in Limerick. Remember, they said, who was it said it, Rachel? That
was the psyche of the map.
Is that the psyche of the map? You know, it's like the dark psyche of the map. So, you know, like people bring stuff to something like that when you have to navigate around a piece, I think, more than when it's static, actually. So, that's all part of the conceptual plan.
And I suppose that's the one thing about like the way in which you've installed Mantle, for example, the very particular qualities of the building mean that people get kind of can get quite close to all of the different levels of it, like in its great height, and can read all of that very fine detail in different ways. Okay, so there's another question here. When a work is finished and exhibited, do you take on meanings other will bring or see in a piece, especially in something like the map? Take on as in use this new perspective to explain the work.
Well, that was just an example of it there a minute ago, you know. So yeah, is the answer to that. Well, I mean, you don't explain it anyway, but it's just that it enriches the experience of it, really, for us, you know, as well as for everybody else. So
very often when you're making things, you are making them intuitively, and sometimes you really only think about certain aspects of it afterwards,
Yeah.
what that might have, you know, been, or you realize you did something because it was, you know, like this. So I think you're always discovering things in your work.
Yeah.
Anyway, and other people see it in a totally different light. And that's perfectly valid. That's their reading of it.
Yeah. And when the map was on show in Tala, you know, in Rua Red, we were amazed at the different kind of approaches that people had, you know, to the work and their different
understandings of
you know,
it.
yeah, people who just made sewing, they were really interested in the sewing part of it, or, you know, so you can enter it from many different doorways. Yeah.
And I think that speaks to the kind of when you were talking earlier on about like not wanting to be didactic in anything, in any of your communication, in any of the kind of the imagery of the map or the imagery of the mantle, that again it leaves a space open for people's own kind of experience and maybe memories, and there's a real generosity to that. So a final question here, somebody who loves the project, so subversive, smart, and beautiful. After New York, do you have any plans or are you accepting invitations to bring aprons of power to other cities? Rachel, I guess that's for you specifically.
I mean, yes, I'm happy to work on the DIY aprons of power with other groups, because I think that's the important part of it, that it becomes this you know, work that is a collective work. So the Hungarian aprons that I have brought to New York, they weren't made by me. It was, you know, I made the framework for it and I created the kind of pedagogy around it, but they're made, they each have the name of their maker on them. So it's like a kind of collaborative exhibition in a way. Some people wear them, some people perform them, and it kind of generates its own space in that way. And I think that's really important.
Thank you, Rachel. That's really, again, I think this idea of an artifact that you have created, but that proliferates through other makers and creators is really, really exciting.
Hyper branching, Sarah.
Absolutely, it's the hyper branching.
Absolutely, hyper branching, which leads me on to, I think, what's going to be our final question, because I'm conscious we've gone over time. But this is a question from Katie, who is saying, you spoke earlier about Celtic knots and how they are a continuous line, always touching. In relation to Untying the Knot, do you feel as if it's a single thread of history with its own collection of knots, or many threads of different histories and shared experiences knotted together? Which is kind of a question that I think probably needs a longer answer than maybe we have time for.
It's a beautiful phrase. Like, it's a beautiful description of what she's talking about. So she's obviously thinking about that herself, and that is like the hyper branching of Celtic knotwork, because it just goes, you know, round and round and back to where it began.
But it also has no origin, and I think that really is possibly the answer to the question.
Yeah.
In a way that, you know, is there a single thread? I don't think there's a single thread.
No.
I think it's always multiple threads.
Crossing over.
You know, and sometimes they become a single strand at a particular place, but then they branch off again. So.
And nothing stays the same, you know.
No.
Nothing stays the same. It's either unknotting itself, or else it's tying itself up in knots, you know. So
the language of textiles is so rich to kind of, with all the metaphors that we can use to think through history and memory and politics and narratives, and whose narrative gets to be expressed and whose gets to be suppressed. And you've given us so much rich material to think through and such beautiful objects to think through it with. And I suppose we've gone quite considerably over time now. So I'd like to thank you so much for your patience, and thank you so much for your generosity. Thank you to Rachel Gilkey for her generous invitation to me to be part of this conversation. And Alice and Rachel, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to us. Really appreciate it.
Our pleasure.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. Have a lovely day in New York, and good evening, everybody.
Slán.
Bye. Slán agus Banach.